Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. Thank you for joining this socialprotection.org webinar on when social protection and labour market policies coincide, public employment programmes at the intersection of employment and social protection policies. My name is Anna McCord and I will be the moderator for this session. And I'd like to start by thanking colleagues at socialprotection.org for hosting a series of 3 webinars. This is actually the first of 3. And these webinars are looking at the role of public works in a changing geopolitical and climate context, trying to pull out lessons from the future. And the reason we put this webinar series together was that we wanted to take the opportunity to share some recent work trying to critically engage with public works programming in a changing geopolitical and climate context, because we're entering an era of massive labour market disruption with significant geopolitical changes, technological changes, changes in the nature and structure of the global economy, which has really major implications for the way that labour markets are going to perform. And I think we can anticipate significant labour market disruption across the world in the coming decades. And public works have played a role at other historical points of similar labour market disruption during the Industrial Revolution, during the interwar period, during the period of decolonisation, and most recently during the 2008 FFF crisis, the food, fuel and financial crisis. And so public works programmes have played this key role at moments of global structural change. And so this series really tries to think about what is the role of public works programmes in that context. And in this series, we're using the term public employment programme and public works programme interchangeably to mean non-market state-sponsored employment. So the question is, what is the role for public works programmes as social protection, as a macroeconomic stabiliser, as a labour market stimulus? And what can we learn from the experiences over the last decades? Because many agencies have been implementing these programs, many governments have implemented programs. So what can we learn and how can we design them better to meet these future challenges? So to this end, I'm working with colleagues from the bank, from the ILO and from ODI to share recent research that they've been doing into these areas. And so over these 3 series of webinars, we'll be hearing from colleagues from those institutions and also bringing in panelists with their own experience of different implementing public works programs in different contexts, different country contexts, coming from different perspectives. So we're very much looking forward to hearing the panelists' inputs along with those of the authors of the papers. So what we have is today's paper, and then the next one is on the 22nd of May, which is about the impacts of public works programs with a focus on natural resource assets. It's going to look at questions about how we evaluate impacts and also provide a kind of political economy impact of the way that we think about program design and evaluation. And then the one on the 26th of June, which is based on a World Bank paper, is going to be looking at innovations in public works, looking at green public works, digital public works and public works in the care economy. So really looking at how they can be adapted to meet contemporary challenges. So if you're interested in those other 2 workshops, please do join us. You can register on sp.org. But now I'd like to introduce today's session. And what we're going to be doing today is focusing on a recent ILO paper which explores the challenges of trying to balance the different policy objectives which are often combined within public works programs or public employment programs, and the trade-offs that can sometimes occur. Because often we see a mixture of social protection objectives, labour market objectives, even macroeconomic stabilisation objectives, and there can be tensions and challenges when one of these sets of policy priorities dominates over others. And there can be tensions because sometimes these kind of trade-offs aren't explicitly recognised. So in this paper, there's an attempt to try and pull out what those trade-offs are and how they might best be resolved. So what I'd like to do is introduce our presenters for this paper and the panelists that we have. The paper will be presented by Maikel Lieuw-Kie-Song and Christina Behrendt. Maikel works for the ILO. He's worked in the field of infrastructure development and employment creation, environmental restoration and public works for more than 20 years. And since 2015, he's worked as a technical specialist in the employment intensive investment program of the ILO. So he is coming from the employment policy perspective. And then the other presenter from the ILO is Christina Behrendt, who is head of the social policy unit in the ILO. So she is coming from the social protection perspective. And then we have three discussants, and we're delighted to have Cecilia Mulindeti-Kamanga with us. She'll be our first discussant. She is the former Labour Commissioner in Zambia and has more than 25 years of experience at continental, regional and national level, working on labour and employment policies and programmes. Then we have Kate Phillip, who is head of the Presidential Employment Stimulus Initiative in the South African Presidency and has worked on the design of public works programs for many decades. And finally, we have Lucas Lena, who is an assistant professor at the University of Edinburgh, working on social and labour market policies and previously worked for the ILO. And he has led the design and evaluation of the Marienthal Job Guarantee Pilot, which I'm sure he'll be telling us more about. So what I'd like to do now is just tell you how the session is going to work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with socialprotection.org webinars. As normal, the session is being recorded, and along with this presentation, it will be available on sp.org and sent to all registrants after the session. I'd like to invite you to use the chat box to introduce yourselves, to present yourselves, make comments, and share any relevant, useful links that you would like to with the community participating in the webinar. Zoom AI is going to generate automatic captions. So if you'd like to see them, click on the CC, that's closed captions button at the bottom of the page. And finally, the way that this webinar works is there's not an opportunity for directly speaking and giving questions to the panelists and the discussants that way. We invite you to put your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box if you can. And then we will come to these and pull out the questions and raise them with the presenters at the end of their presentations. And we'd like you to state your name and organisation. And if your question is directed to a specific speaker, please also make that clear in the Q&A box. Okay, thank you very much. Now, the flow of this session will be, first of all, this introduction, which is now coming to an end, then 20 minutes of presentation by the authors, followed by discussants looking at the presentations for 30 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions and answers. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first presenter, Maikel Lieuw-Kie-Song. Maikel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and welcome everybody also from my side to this webinar. As Anna mentioned, I'll be presenting together with Christina. It's based on a paper that's also Anna co-authored, as well as our other colleague, Mito Sakamoto. The paper is called, as already addressed, Public Employment Programs at the Intersection of Employment and Social Protection Policies. And it's really collaboration also from the ILO between our two departments to really look at these programs from those two lenses. And how do they complement each other, and how do they at times also perhaps contradict each other, or there are trade-offs that we need to think about. Next slide, please. So PEPs, as we call them, public employment programs, really, they really generally have to have three sets of objectives. There is the employment objective, which I think everybody's quite familiar with. It's really about, yes, putting people, either unemployed people or underemployed people, depending on the context, and providing them with employment. This is often, or usually, one of the key goals. There's also often a social protection goal, in that it's not necessarily employment for anyone, but it's trying to provide employment to specific groups who have specific needs. Either they're vulnerable, or they have other difficulties in accessing the labor market, but they're often people without sufficient income and the public employment program is there to supplement their income. Um, um, and that's usually kind of framed within the social protection side. And then critically, the program, because people work and they produce, the programs aim to provide assets and services as well in the process. So these three objectives need to come together, and in some ways, this diagram tries to show that. And it's really where they overlap, where you have interaction between these three that we talk about, really about public employment programs. Now, it goes without saying, but it's still worth emphasizing that it's really the national context that shapes often how these three objectives come together and how we design a program that these three objectives are met. Sometimes there's more emphasis on one objectives on the other, again, driven by national contexts. If there's a severe shortage of assets and services in some poorer rural areas, that may be a much higher priority. In other cases, it may be the employment one or the social protection one, again, depending on the context. So it's really responding to these three gaps, ideally simultaneously. That's why we have these programs. And the way we design them is really informed by the relative emphasis on the three. Next slide, please. Now, in the program, we try in the paper actually, and this is a lot of this in annex. We really look at the national context because these really shape the programs, and there's really two sets of factors that really are important. And one is the labor market context, levels of on and underemployment, right? So what's the surplus labor, if you want to call it that? How many people are there available and interested to work in this program? And also levels of informality, which can also be shape how we approach these programs, how we design them, who the target group is, what type of measures we deliberately include into the program, often to address some of the key issues around informality. But then there's also a broader institutional context, the national social protection system. So what other measures are there in place to address or support vulnerable populations, for example? Compliance with international labor standards, and this in some ways is core to the ILO, but this is also gives us a sense how well developed the labor market is in this country. And often linked to that is really the institutional capacity and reach. And there especially of labor market institutions such as minimum wage, public employment services, other active labor market programs, etc. And all of these together really help us think through what the design and what the program needs to respond to as well. Now, it's worth noting that a lot of these programs operate in crisis situations, and one can take that back to these factors, in that it's really in crisis situations that either some of the institutions break down, or they stop functioning, or they function much less than they used to. So there may be a inability, or the national social protection system may be partially compromised, or the levels of unemployment and underemployment have increased dramatically due to the crisis. So that's it's easily to link these contexts to the crisis context. And really, in the end, it's what are the gaps that we're trying to address. Next slide, please. Now, I mean, this slide really tries a little bit to bring out, let's say, the theory of change, so to speak, around PEPs. And it's looking really at, you have the PEP on the left. I mean, the outputs really match in some ways objective, right? The wage is income linked to both employment and social protection. The skills experience is integral to the employment, and the asset services we already discussed. But through then the set of outcomes that it achieves, really the PEPs, and this is achieves from the ILO's perspective, really to three of our core global policy objectives. The one is around full employment. The second is around universal protection. And the third is just transition. And this is transition from to more sustainable society. So PEPs we see positioned in that sense as critical or important instrument to help us achieve these three core ILO goals. Next slide, please. Now, before we get to some of the more technicalities, I think it's worth stressing two important parts. One is really that work matters, and public employment programs are there because we believe work matters. Not only the ILO, but most societies do as well. Work is more than, and it matters because it's more than just about the income. It's really about inclusion, belonging, contributing, and social recognition, right? So this is work helps us achieve these. It's really in many societies a marker of transitions to adulthood. So it is when one starts working and becomes independent that one can often be seen as a full adult in many societies, and treated like that and respected like that. We know that work through economic participation builds a host of capabilities, um, networks, life skills, self-discipline, teamwork, creativity, accountability, collective organization, management skills. And these are all core, and these are all important. And these are often really either only learned through or really strengthened through work. So these are all matter. And it's for this is one core reason why these programs, we have seen them around the world in many countries, because there's a quite widespread belief in that sense that work really matters. And I'm gonna now pass on to Christina, who's gonna continue on this slide.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Maikel, and also a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined the webinar, also from my side. And actually, now when we were kind of preparing this slide, it was quite interesting because, I mean, we thought, well, we want to talk about the value of work on the one hand, but also the value of social security. And in really preparing the slide with these kind of two parts, it was quite interesting because we realized that it was quite about very, very similar elements, and you can see those very similar elements in the slide. So it's also, when it comes to social security, and I'm using social security and social protection interchangeably here, it is also more about just the income. I mean, we talk a lot about income security, and it's also about access to health, but it's also too much more than that when it comes to really solidarity, when it comes to social contract, when it comes to social inclusion. And I think this is an important part of that story as well. When we talk about social security, I mean, we talk also about a universal human right, just as we talk about the right to work. We also talk about the right to social security. Really throughout people's lives. And again, similarly to what Maikel has just said, when it comes to work, there is also a very important element of building capabilities, of really having access to very essential areas of life, and as I said, some nutrition, health, education, skills, development, but also access to care and other services. And social security or social protection is very, very important, especially during life and work transitions, to really help people to navigate those transitions. And it is a very important pillar of decent work. And it really has a kind of a very important element when it comes to reducing economic insecurity, vulnerability, poverty, and inequality. It's really about providing people with a peace of mind. And it's quite interesting also that recent studies have emphasized again how much this is also a very, very important social determinant of health. So it is really, and it has an impact also when it comes to the economy as a whole. So it is really also really this broader value of social security, just as we talk about the value of work, the value of social security. And I think one important point here is really to see that, I mean, just not as every type of work and every kind of work will do. I mean, we really need to talk about decent work. It's the same for that not every type of social protection we do will do. I mean, we really need to think about making sure that it is adequate, that it's comprehensive, and that it really reaches everyone. And if we can go to the next slide. I can explain that a bit more when it comes to the dimension of how public employment programs can also be an important part of social protection systems, and especially social protection floors. And when we talk about social protection floors, what we mean is basically this ground floor of social protection systems, which is really about guaranteeing effective access to at least essential healthcare and at least a minimum level of income security. And here, in fact, public employment programs play a very important role, and they're also mentioned in the ILO Social Protection Floors recommendation. But again, I think there are important principles that really shape that. And again, not any program will do. So the important principles which are laid down is really very much about ensuring a rights-based approach, which is really anchored in national legislation, and it's in line with human rights and international labor standards. I've already mentioned the comprehensive and adequate protection, looking at the predictability of benefits. But then also important principles regarding non-discrimination, gender equality, responsiveness to special needs, social inclusion, including, of course, those in the informal economy, and then also have a very important role of social dialogue and participation in that respect. And I think this dimension is essential also when we talk about the social protection perspective on public employment programs. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And this is really where, again, Maikel has been talking about the public employment programs at the intersection of social protection and employment promotion, and the fact that it really contributes to both of those objectives. And here's a bit of another way of demonstrating that and showing how it is located amongst the different instruments on the employment side when it comes to, for example, the different types of active labor market policies, but then also on the social protection side. And here, I think one critical link is the link with unemployment protection. And in many ways, also public employment programs, and especially when we talk about employment guarantee schemes, like is the case in India's Mahatma Gandhi employment guarantee scheme. These are sometimes considered as a functional equivalent to unemployment protection, especially when it comes to context of high informality. And I think there also the link with the context of a just transition is important. And I think this is something which will also be picked up again in the following other two seminars. And with that, I'm handing back to Maikel.
Thank you, Christina. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Now, a critical part of the reality, let's put it that way, when we get into actually implementation and when we get into the design of these programs, that yes, we want to achieve these three objectives, as I mentioned earlier, simultaneously. We want to perfectly balance the employment and social protection goals and objectives. But often when we get into the reality, I think we often face constraints and difficulties. And this is really a core part of this paper to say, well, where are these potential trade-offs, the potential, and how can we address these? How can we measure these and manage these? Sorry. So, I mean, some of the more common ones, there are many more, and we've simplified it because sometimes the trade-offs actually are between the three elements that I mentioned earlier. But I just want to talk a little bit about some of the key ones we're most familiar with. So one is often around the quality and quantity of employment, right? So on the one side, there's pressure both from employment and social protection perspective to go to a certain scale where we cover, the entire target group. Anybody who's willing to work, or all the unemployed, or in certain seasons, all the underemployed. But this then, in a budget constrained environment where most of us reside, balances off against both the wage level. So how much wage do we pay to the participants? What's the level? And the duration? How long can people actually be accommodated or working in the program? So of course, on the one hand, you could say, well, people can stay as long as they would like. We don't limit that, but then you need more resources. Or you may say, well, we have limited resources, so we limit the duration of how long each participant can be in the program. And we limit it, based on budget, and there are a host of variations around the world, from very short to 20 days, 40 days, 100 days in India, or no limits, depending on the fiscal situation. So this is one really common, and of course the wage level, the higher the wage level, if we have a specific budget envelope, the fewer people we typically are able to accommodate. And so this is also then often attention about like at what is the light level to pay participants. In the next slide. Another one that's a bit more goes around, or not as obvious perhaps, is really around targeting, and I'll call it here the cost of targeting, but there's different ways we could look at it. But so what we see, for example, is programs with a more labor market perspective and a more employment perspective. They tend to focus more on individuals, because employment is an individual. It's a contract between employer and employee, which is it's very individualized dimension. And often in employment program, we see more self-targeting, where it's the person decides that he or she needs to take up work, and based on that decision enters the program. Where there is a stronger social protection perspective, often we see that there is more focus on identifying workers who are more vulnerable. And often then we look at vulnerability not only from the perspective of the individual, but from the perspective of the households. And often the eligibility and the targeting then gets shaped at the household level, not the individual level. Now, these both bring pros and cons, and again depends really on the context, as I mentioned earlier, and the goals. What gaps are we trying to fill, and how do we what's the best decision or the best approach in this specific context. The last one, the next slide, please. In terms of trade-offs, is one between really the employment side and partially the social protection, because the school and coverage goes there, and the assets and services. So typically a program has, if most of the money goes to labor and salaries, there's limited inputs to improve or produce a certain range of assets and services required. So if one wants to as part of the service rehabilitate schools, for example, in a crisis context, one needs building materials, paint, school benches, etc. And some of the resources need to go to that, but this leaves few resources to go to salaries. So again, this is often a trade-off. What's the appropriate share of resources to dedicate to the non-labor inputs, to ensure that the type of assets and services required are truly produced and are useful, but balancing that against what's the scale of the program we ideally have, how do we reach as many of the target group or of the population who are themselves decide that they require employment in these programs. How do we reach as large a segment of this group? So let me then pass back to Christina, who's going to talk a little bit more about how we can perhaps manage some of these trade-offs. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Maikel. And can we go to the next slide, please? So I think it's a big goal to talk about how to manage some of the trade-offs. I mean, in the paper we have discussed some of them in a bit of detail, to think about some of the possible way of addressing the trade-offs and how they can be minimized. And I think you've already mentioned some ways what you just said. So now for this slide, we have put together a number of recommendations, or at least points of considerations that could be considered. I don't want to go through all of them in much detail, but maybe just pick out some of them and just say a few words on them. I think when it comes to this question of household versus individuals, and it's true that many of the public employment programs which have a very strong social protection component, they're use targeting mechanisms which are very much based on the household. But in fact, I mean, this is also, I mean, you highlighted the tensions when it comes to an employment perspective, but I think there's also important tensions when it comes to when looking at it from a social protection perspective. I mean, knowing the kind of, I mean, the gender dynamics in households, knowing the age dynamics in households, I think there is a risk if it's purely, I mean, if it's purely left to the household to decide who should be kind of taking part in the program. It's likely that women and also potentially also, I mean, either younger people or older people might lose out of these opportunities. So I think taking it a bit broader and really also thinking about a more individualized approach from a social protection perspective can actually try to overcome some of those dynamics. I think just another point that I wanted to pick up on the social protection side is the last one, which is promoting access to other social protection benefits. And I think this is really an area where we can really benefit also from operational synergies and benefiting from the outreach that can be done through public employment programs and linking it also to access to other types of benefits. So not just looking at public employment programs in isolation, but also thinking on how to address other needs where it's difficult. It might be difficult to reach those households. And then maybe kind of crossing over to the employment side and knowing that we have only limited time. I think one of the critical points that I wanted to highlight on that side is also really the question of, I mean, what are the productive assets and services that are being created? And obviously, traditionally, there's a very strong emphasis on infrastructure. But I think looking at services, and I think this is one of the innovations that we've been seeing, is also looking at different services like childcare services, for example, or other social services. I think this is an important area where also innovation can help to improve the programs and also help that they become more gender responsive. And they're also catered to broader needs and can be linked more systematically also to skills developments in those areas. So just a few words on that, and then we're going to move to our final slide. So this is again trying to summarize. If you can move to the next slide, please. So this is really trying to summarize what are ways in which public employment programs can respond to these kind of broader employment and social protection policy objectives, and really thinking of how they can become also more solid stepping stones for the future. And let me, in that case, start with the employment side. And I think this is really something where looking more deeply into the way how these programs can look more systematically into improving working conditions, but also looking into ways of really providing a stepping stone for people into quality employment and ideally formal employment. And I think this is an important part also where public employment programs can have an important spillover effect into kind of local labor markets, especially for those who are kind of disadvantaged and groups which are particularly vulnerable and at risk of precarious employment. So really looking more systematically into enhancing the capabilities through work experience, the training, skills development, and really linking those programs more systematically to public employment services, which in many cases also require some strengthening, or TVET institutions, active labor market policies. I think there's really an area where much can be done. And I think that also has a very important link to labor productivity. And on the social protection side, I think what is important is, on the one hand, to strengthen social protection within the public employment program. So maybe making sure that the participants in those programs do not just have an income, but they also have protection for key areas, such as access to healthcare, having maternity protection, having protection in cases of work injuries, etc., is important. Again, the link to transitions to formal employment after the participation in the program. And for both, the link to both social insurance and more life cycle oriented non-contributory schemes, such as child benefits, but also social assistance is important. And again, emphasizing the link to a rights-based perspective. And I think with that, I'll wrap up and I'll hand back to Anna on that. So thanks. And we have included some resources on the last slide for you to look at a later stage. So back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Maikel, for that really fascinating introduction to the paper. And I think there are many issues within the paper, and it's being shared in the chat, so people can click on the link in the chat if they want to get access to the paper to look at it in more detail. And the issue that we thought it would be good to explore in more detail with the panelists is this whole question of trade-offs. And I think Maikel presented those 3 sets of trade-offs between labour and non-labour costs, the quality versus the quantity of employment. What's the priority, to maximise the amount of employment, or to look at the quality of that employment? And then this whole question about targeting, who should participate in these programmes? I think these are actually some of the real dilemmas that are explored in more detail in the paper and that were beautifully explained here. And so what I'd like to do is to invite our 3 panelists, that's Cecilia, Kate and Lucas, to reflect on the potential trade-offs between differing policy objectives, particularly with a focus on social protection and labour market sector objectives. And I'd like them to reflect on those trade-offs as they were characterised in this paper, and ask them, how does this reflect your own experiences of public works design and some of the challenges that you've been facing? So, Cecilia, I'd like to start by inviting you to give your own reflections on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Let me start by saying that usually PEPs are introduced in the country for different reasons. And I think one of the reasons that was mentioned in the paper was the issue of prices. And as I make my discussion points, I will also be referring to a Cash for Work program in Zambia, which is a PEP. This program was introduced in September 2024 to run up to 2025. And it's a government-funded project, which costs about 1% of the total budget of 2025, standing at 2 billion kwacha. Just to reflect on the trade-offs that have been mentioned in the paper in relation to this program, when you talk about quality of employment versus quality of jobs, in the Zambian situation, there's a wage that was fixed for everyone who's going to participate in Cash for Work to get, regardless of how many jobs will be created. And when you look at the figures in terms of targets of the numbers of participants, they picked a percentage of a population level in a particular constituency or in a particular ward. So because This is because unemployment and underemployment is always there, and you cannot cater for it fully. So it had to be capped by the financial resources provided and by the numbers that participate in this program. So in my view, I think compromising the number of jobs versus a wage is not attainable, because then you'll be diluting the wage and it won't be meaningful. This program in Zambia was created to assist those that suffered the drought of 2023 to 2024 rainy season. That drought brought about energy crisis, it shut businesses, people lost employment, and they had to fend for themselves. So the government introduced this program in order to give some financial relief to those people that had found themselves in a situation where they are unemployed in most cases. So when it comes again to distribution of employment, there must be a reason why a PEP is introduced in any country. And for example, in Zambia, it was introduced because of the drought situation. So even when it comes to distribution of employment, I think those areas that were affected by drought or that are affected by a certain crisis are the ones that should be considered first. Now, when you go to targeting, I know the paper also guides that perhaps those that have been unemployed for a long time should be considered first in this case. Now, in the Zambian case, apart from the identification of 87 districts out of 116 districts to benefit from this program, in terms of targeted participants, it excludes those that are already on social cash transfers and also on drought emergency cash transfer. This is because the other two programs benefit more households, but this cash for work is targeted at benefiting individuals. When it comes to production of quality assets and services, of course, for you to produce quality assets and services, you require some healthy resources, which may be compromised by the limited PE funds. Therefore, targeting assets and services where capital, technical, and administrative resources are financed by other development programs. In the Zambian situation, what the Cash for Work program focuses on is only the labor component of asset and service production in order to balance the trade-offs. So what is the extent then to which this Cash for Work matches the objectives that we've been taken through the presentation? When you look at the employment objectives, the Cash for Work program actually has created employment. It has also created work experience in terms of those who are working on this program and are not experienced. After this program, they will now be employable. They will have gained some experience. It has also produced some assets. There's been some construction of certain infrastructure and some services. There are places where there were no roads. There was no access to markets for farmers or for any business people to sell their produce or their products. Now some roads have been created due to this program. Some health posts or clinics have been completed by using labor from this Cash for Work program. That is on the employment objective. Now, when you look at the social protection objective, of course, an income security has been provided. People are already receiving some income, which they can survive on. It has cured the unemployment issue. Those that were unemployed are now employed. And the interesting thing about this program is that it's very inclusive. It includes both women, youth, disabled, and so on and so forth. It also provides a sick leave. If you're unwell, you are free to go on sick leave. It also provides a space for mothers to breastfeed their children. And those mothers that have to go to clinics to take their children will still be paid for that day that they're expected to pay. So it takes into account most of these social protection issues. So I can rest my case. Thank you, Anna.
Cecilia, thank you very much for that. I think that was a very interesting exploration of those trade-offs, and very useful to have that real example of them. I'd like now to invite Kate Phillip to provide her comments. Kate, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for all the input so far. It's a tricky conversation, and there always are trade-offs, but sometimes there are more trade-offs than at other times. And I think that what's important here as part of the discussion is to differentiate between contexts in which social assistance and public employment programs are seen as a binary policy choice, and when they are seen as complementary instruments where social assistance is provided through things like cash transfers and public employment programs are complementary to those, creating synergies. And I think the trade-offs are the most acute where public employment programs are presented as a form of proxy for other forms of social assistance. And frankly, they aren't always very good proxies for that. So, I'm working in the public employment space. I'm a keen advocate of these programs, but I don't think they're a good proxy for cash transfers when social assistance is the primary need. If social assistance is the primary need, use the instrument that is quickest and easiest to roll out, and use public employment programs to complement that intervention. Use social assistance and things like cash transfers, and I completely agree with Christina's point that social assistance is also about more than the income, but nevertheless, income does matter, and that form of support is foundational. And when that foundation is laid through social assistance instruments, then it's possible for public employment programs to focus on what differentiates them from things like cash transfers, which is the added value of participation in work. And we've seen this so often where public employment programs are used as a form of proxy for things like cash transfers. All these trade-offs are exacerbated because firstly, in terms of coverage, there's enormous pressure typically on the resources, and what you see is very low wage levels justified because this is a form of social assistance. This is not real work. Work is then a conditionality of support. It's a form of workfare rather than part of empowerment and a right to work. And when you make it a conditionality of support, you actually undermine a critical element of the agency and self-esteem that comes with participation in work. And when you use public employment as a proxy for things like cash transfers and you push wage levels down and you call them stipends and it's not real work, and you're actually, you're not delivering good social protection because typically public employment programs are not regular and predictable income on an ongoing basis. They are typically a short-term intervention that is meant to provide a boost, to provide work experience, to provide a pathway into greater economic inclusion. But they're seldom permanent and ongoing. Even in the context of a guarantee, there are limitations on the number of days of work. So on the one hand, public employment programs aren't a very good proxy. When the real need is hunger and desperation, they're not a good proxy for social assistance. So when you do that, you compromise the social protection effects, and you also compromise the employment effects because you actually shackle public employment programs to a role that they are not optimal for, and you undermine their ability to do well what they really do well. And that is related to the added value of work, the added value of work for participants in relation to the psychosocial impacts of participation in work, in terms of access to networks, the social dimension of work, the capabilities that are learned, let alone the harder skills, but the capabilities in terms of all kinds of some of the things that were listed: teamwork, time management, task management, communication skills. All of these are fundamental to social functioning and to economic functioning. They matter whether your pathway is into private employment or your pathway is into self-employment. These capabilities are critical to supporting people's ability to move towards greater economic inclusion, whatever form that takes. I think also what is important to understand is that where you can design these programs synergistically, you provide a pathway with greater levels of economic inclusion. So the starting point, and it is foundational, is cash transfers to take the edge off hunger and desperation. But people don't aspire to stay on a cash transfer all their working lives. People want to see the opportunity to advance, to participate to greater degrees, to get greater returns for their effort, to make more of a contribution to their societies. In the process as well, part of the added value of participation in work is for the participant, but it is for the community as well and for the society. So in the same way that through public employment, one limits the commoditization of labor and the commoditization of people, by providing an alternative just to labor markets as a means of actualizing labor potential. At the same time, the work that is undertaken is contributing to building the commons, to building public goods and services, to building services that matter in society that are outside of simply the scope of what markets can deliver. And that's another key function of public employment programs, is to augment that element of public service and publicly delivered assets and services. So I think I'll stop there, but I think the key thing is that, there's huge scope for these instruments to work synergistically, and I think the outcomes of both are better when they do. The trade-offs are much more severe, and those trade-offs do exist. They're much more severe when you try to use public employment instead of other forms of social assistance. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Very thought-provoking and stimulating comments there. Thank you. I'd like now to hand over to Lucas, please.
Thank you, Anna. And saw this paper come out, not least because of my own experience of having designed and evaluated a job guarantee pilot program in Austria, where long-term unemployed workers received a job offer if they were unemployed for a year or longer, which they were free to take up, that provided guaranteed employment to test a guaranteed employment pilot. And when I presented the results of this 3.5-year pilot, I was so often over the past years asked by participants whether people asked so often whether this program should be viewed as an active labor market policy or as a social protection measure, and whether people who viewed it as an active labor market policy primarily then actually questioned whether it wasn't actually an active labor market policy, but much more a social protection measure. And it seemed to confuse people, not least officials from ministries of labor, to whom I presented this and who repeatedly asked me about this. So ILO constituents. And why do I think is this question so central, and why did many people ask me about this, in particular Ministry of Labor officials? Well, on the one hand, it matters, of course, for the financing of such programs, of public employment programs, which public funds are being used and can be used to finance public employment programs. But on the other hand, and maybe much more important even, it matters for what the criteria for determining program success are being applied. What criteria for determining program success are being applied? And because public employment programs so far are often seen as active labor market programs only, or at least primarily, their success is primarily being evaluated on improving employment in many of the standard and mainstream evaluations. And in particular, the success is being evaluated on improving non-subsidized employment after program participation. So after participation in the program has completed. And as this is a typical measure for the success of active labor market programs, and indeed, using only this narrow measure, on average, public employment programs have often, in many evaluations, been found to work less well, to be less effective for re-employment integration than other conventional active labor market policies, such as hiring incentives or supply-side measures, such as job search support or training of job seekers, in particular in high-income countries contexts, but also around the world in different contexts. However, there are fundamental problems with using this narrow measure, and this is why I think this ILO paper is so central and so important in bringing us forward. And two of these central problems are, first, participants of public employment programs are often among the most disadvantaged of job seekers and of unemployed workers. So many comparisons comparing participants who are most disadvantaged, even if controlling for many observable characteristics, lack internal validity and don't show us the real effectiveness of the programs. But second, for policymakers, what policymakers and evaluations often neglect is the social protection perspective entirely in determining program success. And why is this? I think it may also has to do the public employment programs are often implemented via public employment services, which in many countries do not have clear social protection objectives, or at least not social protection objectives at the same level with employment objectives. And public employment services often cater towards employers as much as they cater towards job seekers. And as a consequence, public employment programs appear less effective than other ALMP, active labor market policy measures, for re-employment integration after program participation. But I think this view is flawed, and the current ILO paper is an important step in correcting this widely conceived policy misperception. And as Maikel and Christina had on their slide on work matters and social security matters, putting labor market and social protection objectives on an equal level is very important for the assessment of public employment programs. So as a next step, I wonder whether the ILO could promote the inclusion of social protection objectives next to labor market objectives for the standardized evaluation and assessments of what works in these type of programs and in determining the success of public employment programs. And going beyond public employment programs, perhaps it also raises the question whether conventional labor market policies other than public employment programs should also be evaluated on employment and social protection objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. You've set us quite a challenge there. I think that'll be an interesting one to discuss. Thank you. Before we continue with the second question, I'd just like to remind people that if they agree with the panelists, they don't agree, they agree with the presenters, they would like to have more information, please don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A chat, which is to the right of your panel. So please do feel free to click on the Q&A box and add your questions in there. Okay, I'd like to go to the second round of questions for the discussants. We've heard them explain their own experiences of these kind of trade-offs. And now I'd like to invite them to reflect on their experience in minimizing these trade-offs in policy design and program implementation. I think it would be really nice if you could share some key learning points for local, national, and international actors working on these issues, with particular reference to the kind of emerging labour market challenges that we're likely to experience in the coming years. So please share with us your learning points. Thank you. Again, Cecilia, I'd like to start with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I would go straight to my experience in terms of policy design and program implementation. When I was in the Ministry of Agriculture and we're talking about agriculture expansion, as well as livestock population growth, developing those policies, we're also challenged by the environmental policies that were being created by the other agency in terms of deforestation when it comes to agriculture expansion and emission reduction when it comes to livestock population growth. So we had to compromise in terms of what do we really put in the paper so that the two policies can work together. So in terms of agriculture, it was agreed that they have some conservation methods where you can still grow crops within trees. So the trees can still be left and you still grow crops in between. So there are a number of research stations that are doing such a demonstration so that farmers don't have to resort to deforestation. So, and also when you are designing these programs, I think it has to be holistic. Like I said, in this agriculture one, where we had to discuss with the environmental agencies. So equally in a PEP, I think there has to be a holistic way of approaching things because the policy or program itself affects not only labor ministries, it affects those ministries that are charged with responsibility of social protection issues such as community development in our case, the ministries of health. So there are a lot of players that are involved. So there has to be a holistic approach in terms of how you come up with such a program. The other point also has to be engagement of stakeholders. You cannot design a program for the local authorities without their input in terms of their priorities. So it's important that priorities are taken on board. And the last point is that you need active labor market information systems that can inform decision-making processes. For example, how often do you do your labor market surveys so that people are informed in terms of the unemployment levels, the underemployment issues, disability issues. So such information is critical. Now, when it comes to learning points, I think the local actors, like I said, there has to be focus on community priorities because the local authorities, or rather communities, they know what they need as priorities. Is it access to markets? Is it access to health services? Is it access to health education? When it comes to national level, you've got your development plans which guide in terms of how the policies can be in sync with the national policy. So there has to be a serious discussion at that level. And of course, the prioritization being that, are we targeting for an economic growth which is green or not, and what are the best approaches? What kind of smart planning are we going to put in place? And also when it comes to international actors, of course, there has to be promotion of global cooperation to address cross-sectoral challenges. Like we said, it's a cross-cutting issue. It affects various sectors. So that cross-cutting approach should be in place. Thank you.
Cecilia, thank you very much. May I pass over to Kate?
Yes, so in South Africa, in the context of the crisis of COVID, we operationalized the idea of never letting a good crisis go to waste. And in a context in which in South Africa, there'd been a huge social protection gap in that there was no cash transfer or social assistance for the vast majority of unemployed people, and public employment programs were the only form of support, putting huge pressure on those public employment programs to do all the kinds of things we've discussed, spreading the budgets thinly, lowering wages, reducing duration of work, and so on. But during COVID, a cash transfer called the Social Relief of Distress Grant was introduced for the first time for unemployed people. And at the same time, there was a significant expansion in public employment through the presidential employment stimulus. So we've actually had the opportunity to, in a sense, experiment with what synergies can look like and how we can work with these two instruments in synergistic ways to do some of the kinds of things I was speaking about. Within that, there are still many challenges and many lessons in relation to these kinds of trade-offs. And I really enjoyed what Lucas was saying about the problem that in public employment programs, they're expected to be ALMPs, but they're also expected to target the most marginalized, and other ALMPs aren't expected to do that. And the outcomes are differential. But in our context, less than 10% of the unemployed get absorbed into our labor market every year. And so we have to look at a spectrum of different needs within the unemployed. yes, at one end of the spectrum, for those that are relatively close to the labour market, public employment programs can act as an ALMP facilitating transitions into the labour market. And they do that by paying close attention to the kind of work experience that employers are looking for, by trying to link some of the forms of work to areas of labour market demand. I'll give an example. We, in public employment, use people to digitize public records in a context in which global business services and digital skills are in high demand in the economy. So, it's about playing around with those elements that are barriers to people's access to the labour market. But we also have to recognize that even if our labour market demand in South Africa doubles, triples, quadruples in the next 5 to 10 years, more than half of the unemployed will still not get jobs. And so we've had to really pivot to that end of the spectrum, which is where a stronger social protection focus actually does have to come into the picture. And we've experimented with a number of things. And I think one of the instruments we've found useful is the use of part-time work. So 2 days of work a week, which gets people at the national minimum wage to the poverty line. And to try to provide that not as a short-term intervention, but regular and predictable access to part-time work on an ongoing basis, in a way emulating some of the strengths of much social protection. And then seeing that as a contribution to a complex livelihood, and trying to use the public employment program to strengthen those other dimensions of the livelihood. And we're seeing this happening in really interesting ways, so that we're seeing public employment programs doing things like, we have examples where there's welding work done in the program and participants are able to use welding tools for their own income generation outside of their work period. We've seen public employment programs assisting, for example, in food security programs, assisting participants to set up seedling nurseries as enterprises, with the public employment program providing the first market as a form of support scaffolding for that enterprise development. We've seen public employment programs negotiating offtake agreements for the outputs, the food-related outputs of participants on their own pieces of land that's complementary to what's happening in the public employment program. So I think we're having to, because of our context, we're having to really experiment with complementarity, with synergistic approaches, with seeing public employment as embedded within a wider livelihood strategy. Yeah, so let me leave it there. No, one more thing. I think the other key thing is the role of civil society. So amongst our programs, something called social employment, where the principle is there's no shortage of work to be done to make communities a better place. And civil society organizations are supported to expand the good work that they're doing in all kinds of areas: gender-based violence, food security, early childhood development, care, catchment management, environmental programs. Wherever there's energy and initiative at community level, that can be supported and jobs can be created, and in the process strengthen civil society organizations and their capacities and their ability to make a difference at the local level, building agency at multiple levels. So those are some of our key current lessons. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kate. Lucas, over to you.
Thank you, Anna, and really interesting thoughts that are discussed here. As I said in my previous response, public employment programs implemented often by public employment services are typically evaluated under the employment objectives and not under a social protection objective. But public employment services that are often also responsible for administering social benefits, so it may be beneficial to provide public employment services with a social protection objective at the same level with employment perspectives. And while I've argued for that in my previous remark, at the same time, I want to stress that having multiple objectives for one program, as outlined in the ILO paper, can result in a limitation by itself, because it can clearly conflate the determinants of program success. And so when thinking about the trade-offs in policy design, I would now like actually to argue for some clear-cut characteristics that differentiate public employment programs from what they are and from what they are not, and from what they should not be perverted to. And that is forced labor, as well as workfare programs, so pay for benefits instead of a wage. And so I wonder how far future work of the ILO would like to go in sharpening these definitions of public employment programs under the employment and social protection objectives. It may appear far-fetched, but the differences to forced labor and workfare programs depend only on some key characteristics, such as whether the program participation is really voluntary, whether the program pays an actual wage instead of benefits, whether the program is how accessible it is, I think is also key, and whether the program provides meaningful employment. And I think that relates to many of the comments that were made already, because employment for many participants has not only the material benefits, but also what are called the latent benefits of employment that provide for many people, whether we like it or not. But in our societies, work provides for many people deep psychosocial stability functions, such as a collective purpose in life, activity, a time structure. Otherwise, if these principles of voluntariness and an actual wage instead of benefits are not followed, public employment programs could easily be turned into a measure to pressure people into poor quality work, and instead of reducing, rather increasing stigma for those then who do not take up these poor quality work opportunities. Following these principles is not always obvious. For instance, the principle of receiving an actual wage and not simply benefits for work or participation in a public employment program would already exclude potentially some programs that are typically counted as public employment programs. And so by following these principles of a voluntary participation and an actual wage for work in the program, public employment programs would actually provide an outside option to some of those people who are among the most vulnerable in our societies, for whom it is the hardest to find a job, and then an outside option that increases their bargaining power in finding regular employment, but also their bargaining power in their private lives, be it towards benefit administrators or within their families. And with that, I would like to conclude and congratulate you on this very important paper that I look forward to also bringing into further into the academic discussion, where I think will provide a very important contribution.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to our presenters and to our panelists for those very stimulating discussions, and particularly, I think, very helpful learning points and recommendations. I mean, Cecilia, looking at this whole cross-sectoral policy integration, how that's a critical element if you're going to have decent quality public works design. Lucas, reminding us that actually you can end up creating very poor quality work, and you can be requiring that people work to receive a benefit, which is their right, which can be problematic. And Kate saying, well, maybe even in some contexts where you know that you have chronic unemployment, that actually you need to look at alternative policies, unless you're in a position to implement large-scale employment guarantee schemes, then perhaps cash transfers are more appropriate. And I think this really reflects one of the other issues that came up in the paper, which is that things are very context-specific. How we apply this mix of public employment programs or cash transfers, how they relate to each other, and how they relate to your labour market policy depends really on the maturity of the social protection system, the level of formalization, the ability to implement large-scale employment guarantee programs, or perhaps it's more appropriate to have these emergency kind of public works programs that Cecilia was describing to us as a response to an emergency. So I think very many issues have come up, and I thank our presenters for that. And I'd like to just turn to some of the questions that have come up from the floor. And first of all, we have a question from Kutaiba Al-Ibadi, thank you very much, who says that in Iraq, 66% of the labor force and 57% of employers are informal. What's the expert advice to answer the policymaker question of what's the key boundary between cash for work, public employment programs, and public works programs? And I think here, the question is, can you extend cash transfers in a context where you don't have a formalized employment system? Can you have employment-based cash transfers? Are public employment programs the answer? So for that question, I'd like to hand over to Maikel and Christina. Could they respond to Qutaiba Al-Abdi's question there, please? I think you can see it in the chat. If not, I'm happy to repeat it for you.
Yeah, no, I thanks, Anna, and I managed to look at the question in the chat. It's not an easy question at all, but I think again, I think the starting point is context, I would say, and I mean he provides some context indicators, but there's more, like what's the social protection system look like in Iraq, especially for these people. Are there other measures they can access? And it links also to his other question later on, I think, around wages. So these, I think the context will really, that's what we're advocating here clearly, is shaping how we approach some of these decisions. So if we have people who have other social protection measures they could potentially access to, then my response would be different than if this is the only thing they would potentially rely on, and in that case they maybe have to think about it differently. And this goes also to the question of how many days, if I get the question right, should be provided. And of course there are, and then of course fiscally, of course there are these questions, but I think we should, I think, have the full contextual picture really to engage with these questions fully, and not only think of, which I think this is an important point other people made, not only think of public works then as the instrument to address this this problem, but actually if we look at the context as a whole, what is the combination of public works along with other measures, be it labor market or cash trans or social protection, that can respond to the to the goal or the need that we have there. So that would be my thanks. I pass back to you, Anna, or I know Kate or Christina wants to add anything.
Christina, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, not really much to add. I think what Maikel just explained is really looking at the context, and I think this also links quite well on the point that Kate has made before on really looking at the complementarity of the different programs that is there, and maybe also thinking about the broader context, also about how to use, the different programs, both the public employment programs, but also the social protection system as a whole, to really think about ways of how that can support, in the longer run, the transitions of both enterprises, but also workers from the informal to the formal economy. I think this is more a kind of a longer term perspective, but I think it's an important element as well. And I would really also like to hear, I see that Kate has switched on her camera and looks like she wants to come in as well.
Hey, before you come in, thank you for that, Christina. May I also ask you to consider the second question that we had from Qutaiba Al-Ibadi. He's also asking about how you might set the wage rate. Should it be lower or higher or matching the minimum wage? And I know you touched on this, Kate, in your presentation, the dilemma, the ethical questions around paying people less than a wage and requiring them to work in return for social protection. So could I invite you to both follow on from Christina's comment, but also maybe reflect a little bit on that whole question of wage setting, which is really a critical one. And Qutaiba Al-Abadi, thank you for raising that question. Kate?
Yes. If I can go straight to the wage issue, it's a tough one. In South Africa, our public employment programs had a minimum wage promulgated, and then later we had the introduction of a national minimum wage. And there was a very wide consultative process of setting the national minimum wage at the minimum living level. And the wage that was set was 45% above the public employment wage, a huge gap. That gap was actually defended by our public employment programs on the basis that they were socialist, their function was primarily social assistance. So you can see that debate coming in very directly in that context. In the context of the presidential employment stimulus, we used the national minimum wage instead. It made the programs a lot more expensive, I have to say, which made the policy case that much harder. This is a reality of the trade-offs. But I think where we've ended up settling as well is what we also found is that you do want people to have an incentive to find employment in the market. You don't actually want your public employment programs to be a preferred alternative to looking for work in the private sector. And so we've ended up settling on around 80% of the national minimum wage as a defensible level that creates a better wage than has been the case, but also allows the national minimum wage to be an aspirational entry point into private employment. It's not perfect. I can argue this I can argue any one of the positions if you ask me to, and have in my time. So it is a really tricky question. Yeah, there's no doubt. It's also very context specific in the sense that you do have to think about what is the market wage and what is the market wage in formal employment, but what is the market wage in informal employment? And will you be attracting people out of informal employment? And if you are doing that, maybe you should be doing that if that informal employment is horribly precarious and very low wage. So these are all part of the dilemmas. I don't know, Anna, if you want me to answer the question about co-ops as well, which was the one I saw.
Yes, Kate, before you do, I think it would just be nice to mention that, I mean, I think that point you make about, is it appropriate to reflect the market wage or the minimum wage? That's a real dilemma. Often the minimum wage hasn't been reset for many years in many countries, so it doesn't reflect needs. So if you're looking at social protection, then we would actually want to make sure that the financial transfer is enough for people to meet their basic needs. So if you're setting it at either the minimum wage or the market wage, that may not be enough to ensure that households have sufficient income security. So there is a dilemma there. In Malawi, we have GANU wage labour, extremely low levels. So some public works programs chose to match the GANU level, but then you end up having people in exploitative, working for exploitative wage levels. So there's a real dilemma around that. In India, where they set it at the minimum wage, it actually, because it was implemented on a large scale, it had the effect of putting in a floor. So it pushed up, in several states, it actually pushed up the minimum wage that for all workers. So it's a very interesting question. Yes, and as Kate said, there are many answers to it. Kate, we need to finish in a few minutes. So may I invite you to just take a minute or two to respond to the question on cooperatives, and then we'll give Maikel and Christina the last word. Thank you. Kate.
I will try to be very quick on this. I spent a decade working with co-ops. I've written a book on answering the question that has been asked. You're welcome to look for it. It's called Markets on the Margins. But in very brief,
could repeat it. That would be great for us. Thank you.
Okay. In brief, in the rest of the world where co-ops have succeeded, producer co-ops that create jobs are a very small component of the co-op movement. And most co-ops are user co-ops, things like consumer co-ops, agriculture co-ops, credit unions. And those provide the economic base for the producer co-ops. In South Africa, because jobs is the imperative, the emphasis has been on producer co-ops without that wider support network. I think the second reason is our economic structure, where small-scale production of local needs struggles because of our monopoly sector that produces absolutely everything that is consumed in the production, in the consumption basket of the poor. Maize meal, flour, bread, tea, you name it, is all mass produced in our core economy. And so co-ops suffer the same competitive constraint as small enterprise. And my final point is that if you look around the world where co-ops have succeeded, they have succeeded in contexts where there are existing strong small enterprise sectors. We don't have that in South Africa because of our history, and we've tried in a way to leapfrog the development of that sector by going straight into co-ops, which are a harder form of enterprise to run than a traditional enterprise because of the difficult demands of democratic ownership, control, and management. So, you know, those are just three answers, but please do have a look at my book.
Okay, thank you. You might like to put details of your book into the chat. Maikel, Christina, I'd like to just give you 2 minutes of a last word to reflect on what you've heard and share any final insights with us all. Thank you.
Okay, let me go first because I was actually quite keen to enter the wage debate, and I don't have time. But I mean, perhaps the point there to make is also what's the process by which the public works wage gets set, right? I mean, it's about the way, but actually, what is it based on? And if it's not the national minimum wage, right? Is it a, you know, and I think because the national minimum wage can be a very good benchmark, but it can actually also not be appropriate. But it's like, what's the process for setting this public work wage rate? And in what's it informed by? And I think that's really, and again, our objectives then are going to again drive. If it's a more labor market, we're going to go there, and if it's more social protection. But you know, we need to find the right balance. But it shouldn't just be a technocratic element. And also, the market wage can be deceiving, for example, because the market wage for women, for example, can be very different from the market wage for men in many areas. And if you say we're going to do below, you know, the market wage, what are we talking about? So there are a lot of complexities that come to the wage. So again, we could talk about this for hours. But maybe to wrap up, I want to, I mean, the point that Lucas made, I think, in my experience, is really critical. Like, what defines program success? And I think this is both at the kind of rigorous evaluation level, but also in the public minds, the public perception level. This is really important because I think public works program create a certain, interpretation how people see them. And program success will vary very much also from person to person, from politician to politician. So the communication of what program success should or should not look like, accompanied with, you know, the kind of rigorous setting of, you know, measuring and objectives and whether we achieve this, the combination of this is actually, I think, a really critical element to actually program success. And I want to maybe, from my side, end with, we had actually recent seminar in Bangladesh along all of these theory, and I think it was a really insightful comment from someone to say, like, actually what you want to look at when you look at these programs are the 3C. You want to look at community and all its dimensions, how they participate, how they benefit, what their role is. You want to look at convergence, how they converge with other policies, social protection, employment, but also agriculture or urban development or wherever you are. And the last one is credibility, which comes bringing back to the evaluation point. Are they credible? Are they delivering what they promise? And if you can kind of check on those 3Cs, you have a strong route to the programs you want. So that's from my side. Thanks. We over to Christina.
Christina, I can offer you a minute from the floor.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really difficult to come after this this discussion. And really for Maikel also to wrap that up in such a comprehensive way. But let me maybe just kind of add another C, picking up on what, well, maybe even two, just thinking about it. Picking up also on the comments made by Kate, Lucas, and Cecilia. So, I mean, my first C that I would add is the question of complementarity. And I think that speaks very much to the point that Lucas made with regard to how do we make sure that this is not just a workfare program, or how do we make sure that there's very clearly different from forced labor. And I think this speaks very much to the question of, do people actually have a choice? I mean, is it really a conscious choice for them to engage in those public works programs, or are they simply being forced into it just because they need to survive, basically.
Christina,
So-
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to finish in 1 minute, and I just need to
Yeah.
remind people about the next seminars. So can I just invite you to summarize your...
Okay, yes, yeah. So sorry, and let me just add the final C to it, and this speaks back to the what Cecilia mentioned, the context of crisis, because we know that this is quite often the and I think the context of crisis also limits these opportunities. So I think there is a certain tension in that, and maybe I'll leave it at that. With these kind of 5 C's, and handing back to you, Anna. I hope we manage time-wise.
Thank you. And if you haven't been following the 5 C's, we'll write them up and put them in the chat, or we'll certainly communicate them. Thank you to our excellent presenters. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for those participating and for the excellent questions. I'd just like to mention that actually this webinar has ended at a point where it's very nice to move on to the next webinar. It's the 22nd of May, and we're going to be looking at exactly this question: what defines success? How do we measure programs? How are we thinking about the impact of programs? What evaluation techniques do we use? What are the political economy issues shaping what we measure? So I think hopefully throughout this series we can bring some of the ideas from one webinar to the next. So please do come to our next webinar on the 22nd of May. There'll be Eva Ludi, Simon Levine, and myself will be presenting the paper that we prepared, and we look forward to seeing you there. Please bring your ideas, and thank you for being with us today, and I wish you all the best in your work in this, what we've seen is a highly tricky but very important area. Thank you. Goodbye.